Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 393 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. It's been yet another swarmy week, with another 2 collected from my own apiaries. We have a nectar flow at the farm, and I'm using that to draw out more frames of foundation. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. Hi everyone, welcome back, and what an incredibly busy week I've had. No complaints, it's that time of the year again, and although it can be a little tiring at times, it's great to be working with the bees regularly once more. This week's podcast is available for free to everyone signed up to my Patreon page, free as an illustration of what you might enjoy each week as we head into the busiest times, and I hope that you might sign up to the Podcast Plus tier and support further the work that I do in helping beekeepers everywhere. Signing up to Patreon for anyone listening maybe 4 or 5 weeks after this podcast was released will give you access to my podcast on the day it is released, with all the relevant and seasonally timed sensitive information at your fingertips, along with my help and support for anyone feeling the need. Actually, this week I was very lucky to have Steph back with me, as we had our hands full with inspections. Before telling you a little bit more about our week, I need to wind everything back to last Sunday. I had a very busy day working through nukes that had to be readied for transfer into travel boxes for sale. These nukes have been incredibly strong, and here I found 1 or 2 had swarmed. You'll all know by now that I currently supply nukes to Thorn beehives in Rugby, and it's their travel boxes that I use. These are ply nuke boxes, slightly oversized for the frames, with metal Varroa mesh fitted to the sides and roof to give plenty of ventilation during the journey. Moving these nucleus colonies across from polynuke into travel box is generally a fairly straightforward job, but I do like to make sure that I've seen the queen and check that she's properly marked with the correct yearly colour so the receiving beekeeper can spot her without having to spend ages staring blankly at a frame covered with bees. Honestly, it was a full day just completing this fairly simple task, but once complete, felt very rewarding. There's a lot of pleasure to be had from creating a new nucleus colony of honeybees over the course of a beekeeping season to pass on to another beekeeper for their enjoyment in the following spring. And I like them to be the very best that I can produce. It is, however, fraught with all sorts of worries and stresses because, well, the season affects us so very easily. An early season means the bees grow so quickly and develop very, very quickly, and then we're just trying to hang on to them. Anyway, early the next morning, and I mean very early, around 4 a.m, I set off on the journey to Rugby from my home here in Norwich, arriving around 3 hours later, safely and without incident. Nukes dropped off, coffee drank, conversations had, and I returned home feeling somewhat jet-lagged. That persisted through the next day. I should probably have stopped in a lay-by and had a doze, but sleep will have to wait until the autumn. The bees won't wait for sure, and I had inspections to complete. Over at the farm apiary, the bees were out and about foraging on the nearby oilseed rape, and there we have the beginnings of our nectar flow. What is a nectar flow, I hear you cry? Simply put, it's the point at which a group of flowering plants release the bulk of their nectar upon flowering, each, I guess, competing with the other to entice pollinators to visit and get a reward for moving pollen from one plant to another. Plants vary in the timing of this nectar release, but for us beekeepers, it can be generally seen during inspections, when we're working through a brood box and find a lot of nectar being deposited into brood cells through the daytime period. Be warned though at this point, seeing a lot of nectar in brood cells can also signify a colony that has swarmed, so before you rejoice and add 2 or 3 supers, do check for eggs and a laying queen. I'd like to expand on this point because it's not just a straightforward eggs means queen right state of affairs, and likewise it's not just nectar in brood cells means a nectar flow. So we're carrying out an inspection and see nectar in a large number of brood cells. I like to then check for eggs and specifically how those eggs are laying in the cells and where they are laying. Let's assume I find eggs. In my mind, I'm asking myself, am I looking at a good laying pattern? By this I mean, are all of the cells in a given area within a frame laid up with eggs, and are those eggs all sitting in a similar position? Conventional wisdom tells us that when the queen lays an egg, it sits on its end. Imagine, if you will, a grain of rice being balanced on the tip at one end of the grain, pointing straight upwards. The following day, the egg begins to slowly fall sideways, and on day 3 is normally laying on its side at the bottom of the cell, awaiting that metamorphic change into a tiny larvae. If I see a full frame of eggs all looking at a similar age, meaning they all look in a similar position, I can generally accept that I have a queen-right colony. Where questions begin to pop up in my mind is where I see a portion of cells with maybe only a small percentage that have eggs in them, and not in a uniform fashion, more random or sporadic in nature. A few eggs, then empty cells, then maybe a few more eggs. Not necessarily a failing queen, but possibly a colony that has swarmed or is about to swarm. Hold that thought and continue to inspect, assessing all of the time. A frame that contains a nectar flow is a potentially messy affair. As you inspect your colony, frame by frame, maybe, like me, you tilt the frame to look into the cells. At this point, the nectar flow will make itself known to you by dripping, almost flooding, out of the cells and covering the top bars and, therefore, the adult bees on the brood box. That's if you're holding the frame over the hive, of course. If not, you could find that your bee suit needs an urgent wash as you get covered in nectar falling from those cells. Again, it's all about paying attention to what's happening and not simply focusing on the frame in hand. If you do find yourself with nectar dripping from brood frames, you're probably in the middle of a nectar flow and possibly missing the opportunity of adding supers which should have gone on a week earlier. This is particularly relevant if you only have supers with frames of foundation and not drawn comb. The bees need time to draw out the comb in those supers to store the nectar in, so do try to think ahead. Here it's a good idea to take a look around at what flowering plants are budding up. For me, last week, hawthorn, bushes, hedges, they're all showing signs of flowering. And we've been adding supers in anticipation of a nectar flow from this valuable plant. The major nectar flow for me right now is undoubtedly the oilseed rape, and we do have some very productive colonies with 4 or 5 supers on. To be honest, these are the very strongest colonies. Most, I would say, have 2 or 3 supers, but it's looking like a very productive early spring crop of honey. And hopefully that will be coming our way in due course, if only I can manage that urge of reproduction in those colonies. I have no doubt I will succeed in some and fail in others. It's the nature of beekeeping after all. Managing this reproductive phase, also coupled with spring growth, was the topic of a talk I gave yesterday, actually, Saturday, to the Lincolnshire Beekeepers Association. I travelled to the Bomber Command Museum just outside Lincoln for a very pleasant morning and a very thorough AGM presentation before stepping up and offering my views and ideas on how to manage that reproductive phase of the season, a point at which we're well and truly in right now. It was amazing to hear that because of the difference in weather conditions over the early spring period, some beekeepers here had only just started inspecting. And before I forget, congratulations to Kate, Jess and Harry, young beekeepers who each received awards for their beekeeping efforts. It was great to see an association actively encouraging the next generation of beekeepers, a great effort all round. One of the techniques I shared on the day was the 2 nukes from 1 parent colony method, a great way to produce queens and nukes. It doesn't have to automatically mean increased colony numbers. You can use those queens to replace older queens and then unite colonies back to the numbers that you want. With the weather changing to warmer days, I spent a longer period of time with our bees in the last week and was able to use the artificial swarm technique on a number of nucleus colonies to prevent swarming. It doesn't just have to be full-size colonies that are subjected to this method. I don't use full-size national 14 by 12 hives in our apiaries, and so when nukes get congested, something has to happen. It would be wrong for me to simply leave them to swarm, and so, having spent some time accumulating additional boxes for these nukes, I'm able to use the artificial swarm technique to manage that growth and actually produce further stocks of bees. All I do is remove the queen from the nuke on a frame of brood and pop her into a new nuke box full of frames fitted with foundation. This nuke box goes into the position of the old nuke box and thus receives all of the returning flying bees. The other box, now queenless, is moved to another part of the apiary. I use pallets as stands for multiple nuke boxes, so there's usually a spot for them somewhere in the apiary. Queen cells get removed from that nuke, all except one of course, and they're left to care for their new queen once she emerges. The old queen continues to lay eggs in the frame that I've given her, and the returning workers go about producing wax and building comb once more. Elsewhere around the apiaries, a task I must get on with is brood frame replacement, and it hasn't been a simple job this year because some of the foundation I've had has curled and created a somewhat different challenge for me. It's amazing how each beekeeping year seems to throw up a slightly different issue for me to work through. You'll remember that I use a method of double brooding in the spring. This normally gives me a lot of drawn comb to use as replacement for older, darker comb in the overwintered colonies. Very little of the brood comb we have is older than 3 years, I would say. I like to replace it regularly to keep everything fresh, usable, and as free from pests and diseases as possible. The challenge I have is the new comb, drawn on this curvy foundation, isn't going to fit into existing brood boxes without either crushing bees or squishing comb and dripping honey stores everywhere. Not ideal. It's only happened in the Langstroth hives because traditionally these frames don't have grooves in the sidebars for the foundation to slide down and be held in place. This is different to, for example, the national deep frames, which have those channels cut on the inside of the sidebars for the foundation. This keeps it hanging nice and straight as the bees work it and produce comb. My solution to this early season challenge is I've added a queen excluder, trapping the queen in the older bottom brood box, and I'm just letting the bees store honey in the upper brood box. Once it's been filled, it can come off and get extracted or melted out, cut out. I'll figure something out. After that, I'll refit the frames with more foundation and we'll give it another try. Of course, replacing old brood comb can be completed in any number of ways. A Bailey comb change is a great way to isolate old comb, ready to remove and replace. And if you have a major comb change in mind, and perhaps sight of a growing varroa population for instance, a shook swarm will do the job nicely. Both of these techniques are best performed when the weather is on the up, temperatures rising, and of course a decent nectar flow really helps. Feeding is an option if there is no nectar flow, and sometimes we add food as well as relying on the nectar flow for the bees to draw out that foundation. If you don't have an urgent need to replace lots of frames of old comb, maybe just one or two that have become damaged or worn, a rotational method of frame change can be used and is performed during a normal inspection. It takes several weeks. The way I manage this is if, during an inspection, I find a frame I would like to replace, but let's say it's early in the season and full of eggs and young larvae, I might not want to simply pull it out and replace it, wanting instead to allow the brood to develop and emerge as adult workers. Here I would go through my normal inspection routine, and once done, instead of pushing all the frames back and inserting the first frame back into the gap nearest me, I would put it into the brood box on the opposite side to me, thus rotating it through from position 1 to position 10. This is my Langstroth hive made up of 10 frames. The result of this is that all the frames have moved through to a new position. Frame 2 has now become frame 1. If originally, let's say, frame 5 was the one I wanted to remove, this is now in frame position number 4. I follow the same routine for the next few inspections, and each time that damaged frame gets a little closer to the outside edge of the brood box, until eventually it's the first frame that I remove during an inspection. When I've finished inspecting, rather than putting it back in, I remove it and add a frame of foundation. Job done. Finally today, I had a swarm this week. Not unusual, I hear you say, but this one swarmed without any sealed queen cells in the colony at all. There were several open queen cells, but nothing sealed. I had knocked down queen cells on the previous inspection, so I guess they decided they didn't want to wait until I was back with them again, and off they went. Oh well, that's beekeeping, isn't it? Always ready to surprise and always ready to trip you up just when you think you're getting the hang of things. Well, that's it for this week. For all of you who haven't yet signed up to my Patreon page, I, together with Steph, have been creating beekeeping content for many years now. And if you're looking for some straightforward, down-to-earth tips and techniques, help and advice, then do take a look at my Patreon page. We have over 1,700 individual beekeeping posts, videos and podcasts filled with useful and timely help and advice. My approach is pragmatic and calm, sometimes entertaining, but always with help and support for the beekeepers at the heart of what I do. I keep my videos short and concise wherever possible, no waffle, no flannel, just honest beekeeping advice from years of keeping bees. Take a look and join me for the new 2026 beekeeping season. It'll cost you less than a jar of honey, and you never know, there may be something there that will help improve your beekeeping. Check us out online at www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey.